The clatter of cutlery on cheap ceramic plates was the diner's morning song. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, streamed through the greasy windows of the Morning Glory diner, illuminating the worn red vinyl of the booths and the chrome that had long since lost its shine. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where coffee was always brewing and the bacon was always sizzling. For the 5 men packed into the largest corner booth, it was just another Tuesday breakfast, a moment of calm before the road called to them again. They were a wall of leather and steel, even when seated. Their cuts, the sleeveless leather vests that served as their identity, were adorned with the patches of the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club. They were large men, built not by gyms but by hard miles and harder living. Their faces were maps of wind and sun, their hands calloused from gripping handlebars and turning wrenches. To the other patrons, the handful of truckers, the elderly couple sharing a pancake, the waitress named Flo who had seen it all, they were a familiar, if intimidating, presence. They were quiet, kept to themselves, and always paid in cash. At the head of the booth sat Victor, the club's president. His hair was more salt than pepper, pulled back in a tight tail. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, missed nothing. He ate his eggs with a deliberate, unhurried pace, a man comfortable in his own skin and in the silence of his brothers. Beside him was Bear, the sergeant at arms, a man who looked like he had been carved from a mountain. He was methodically destroying a stack of pancakes, a gentle giant in a world that often only saw the giant. Across from them, Ghost, the club's intelligence officer and former Special Forces operator, nursed a black coffee, his lean frame coiled with a quiet energy. Next to him, Doc, a former Army medic with kind eyes that contrasted with his rugged exterior, was explaining the proper way to set a broken bone to a younger prospect named Ricky, who listened with rapt attention. They were a self-contained unit, an island in the quiet sea of the diner. The peace was shattered not by a shout, but by a sound far more alarming, the frantic, terrified gasp of a child. The bell above the diner door chimed violently as a small boy, no older than 7, stumbled inside. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, one of his sneakers was missing, and his face was pale with a terror so profound it silenced the entire room. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his eyes wide and darting, searching for something, for anything. Flo, the waitress, froze mid-pour, coffee sloshing onto the counter. The truckers turned in their seats. The elderly couple stared, mouths agape. They were all frozen by shock, uncertain spectators to a drama that had just burst through the door. The boy's gaze swept past them all, past their pity and their inaction. He was looking for something else. He was looking for safety. His eyes landed on the corner booth, on the 5 large men in their leather vests. For a moment, fear warred with desperation on his small face. Society had taught him to be wary of men who looked like this, but his instincts, the primal need for a fortress, screamed a different message. He saw not danger but strength. He saw a wall he could hide behind. He moved, his one socked foot padding silently on the grimy linoleum. He didn't run to the kitchen or to the other patrons. He ran to them. He slipped into the space between the booth and the wall, pressing himself against the cool vinyl behind Victor's back. The men in the booth had stopped eating. 5 sets of eyes, ranging from piercing blue to dark, watchful brown, were now fixed on the small, trembling form huddled beside them. Victor didn't turn around immediately. He simply stopped, his fork hovering over his plate. He could feel the boy's small body shaking, could hear the tiny, hitching sobs he was trying to suppress. Slowly, Victor lowered his fork and placed his hands flat on the table. It was a signal. The rest of the club mirrored him. Breakfast was over. A tiny hand tugged at the back of Victor's vest. A voice, barely a whisper, thin and reedy with fear, cut through the silence. "Please," the boy breathed. "He's here." Before anyone could ask who he was, the bell above the door chimed again. This time it was a smooth, controlled entry. A man stepped inside, and he was the complete opposite of the bikers. He wore pressed khaki pants, a pastel polo shirt, and expensive loafers. His hair was perfectly styled, his face handsome in a way that belonged on a billboard for a family dentist. He held a practiced, easy smile, but it didn't touch the cold, predatory stillness in his eyes. He scanned the diner, his smile widening when he saw the boy peeking out from behind the booth. "There you are, Leo," he said, his voice a smooth, condescending balm that made the hairs on Victor's arms stand up. "We were just playing a game of hide and seek. Silly me, I couldn't find you." The boy, Leo, flinched and pressed himself tighter against Victor's back, a small whimper escaping his lips. Victor didn't need to see it to feel it. The man, Richard, took a step forward, his confident stride meant to command the room. "Come on now, son, let's not bother these gentlemen. Time to go home." Victor turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes locking onto Richard's. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at him, and in that look was the weight of 1,000 miles of hard road and 100 moments of quiet violence. "The boy doesn't want to go with you," Victor said, his voice a low gravel. Richard's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. He was used to being in charge, to his polished appearance granting him immediate authority. He looked at the bikers with open disdain, his gaze sweeping over their worn leather and tattoos. "I appreciate your concern," he said, dripping with false politeness. "But this is a private family matter. My son is just being a bit dramatic, you understand." "I understand he came in here terrified," Victor replied, his voice still level, still calm. "And I understand he came to us for help." "Look," Richard said, his patience finally fraying. He dropped the pretense of politeness and took another step forward, his hand outstretched towards the boy. "He's my son. I'm taking him home." In a single, fluid motion, Bear moved. He didn't stand. He simply shifted his massive frame, blocking Richard's path. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, a silent mountain of muscle and leather, an immovable object. Richard stopped short, his hand hovering in the air. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his handsome face. He had expected these men to be loud, aggressive, easily provoked. He hadn't expected this cold, unified calm. "I think you should leave," Victor said. It wasn't a suggestion. Richard scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "You have no right. Who do you think you are? I'll call the police." "Go ahead," Ghost said softly from across the table. He hadn't moved, but his phone was now in his hand, his thumb moving swiftly across the screen. "In fact, I insist. While you're at it, you might want to call your lawyer. Richard Sterling, isn't it? Of 1245 Maple Drive." Richard froze. The color drained from his face. His carefully constructed mask of respectability was beginning to crack, revealing the ugliness beneath. How do you know my name?" Ghost looked up from his phone, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. "Public records are a wonderful thing, so are court filings. For example, the one from 6 months ago. An emergency restraining order filed by a Sarah Miller on behalf of herself and her minor son, Leo Miller. It states you're not to come within 500 feet of either of them. Judging by the map, this diner is about 200 feet from their apartment. Bad choice. Very bad choice." The diner was tomb silent. Flo stood with a coffee pot held aloft, forgotten. Every eye was on the drama unfolding in the corner. The mask didn't just crack anymore, it shattered. Richard's face twisted from feigned concern into a mask of pure, undiluted rage. The handsome charm evaporated, replaced by a venomous snarl. "You bikers are all the same," he spat, his voice losing its smooth cadence, becoming harsh and guttural. "Thugs. You think you can interfere in my life. I'll ruin you. I'll have all of you arrested for kidnapping." He made his final mistake. Fueled by ego and fury, he lunged. He didn't go for the bikers. He was smarter than that. He lunged for Leo, trying to snatch the boy from behind the booth. He never made it. Bear was on his feet with a speed that defied his size. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't need to. He simply stepped into Richard's path, his left hand coming up to cup Richard's shoulder, while his right hand planted firmly in the center of his chest. It was not a shove. It was a controlled, irresistible press. Richard's forward momentum was instantly, utterly negated. He was driven backward, his expensive loafers squeaking on the floor, until his back hit the wall with a dull thud. Bear held him there, pinned against the cheap wood paneling, his arm a rigid bar of muscle. Richard struggled for a moment, his face turning a blotchy red, but it was like trying to push over an oak tree. He was powerless. Bear leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You don't touch the kid, ever." It was over in seconds. The explosion of violence was so swift, so clean that it was almost silent. There was no brawl, no shouting match, just the decisive neutralization of a threat. The arrogant predator was now just a panicked man, pinned to a wall by a force he couldn't comprehend. The story of what happened that morning at the Morning Glory Diner could have ended there. But for the Iron Sentinels, it was only the beginning. Their work was far from over. If you believe that true strength is shown not in how you fight, but in who you fight for, then take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter. And let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. We're glad to have you with us. While Bear kept Richard pinned and Ghost calmly spoke to a 911 operator, Doc slid out of the booth. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, his focus entirely on the small boy who was now sobbing openly, the adrenaline giving way to shock. Doc knelt, bringing himself down to Leo's level. He didn't touch him right away, just gave him space. "Hey there, little man," Doc said, his voice soft and soothing. "My name's Doc. You're real brave, you know that? You did the right thing." He looked at the boy's torn shirt and the angry red mark on his cheek. "Did he hurt you anywhere else?" Leo shook his head, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. My mama," he whispered, his voice choked with tears. "He hurt my mama. She told me to run." Doc's kind eyes hardened for a fraction of a second, before softening again as he looked at the boy. "Where is she, Leo? Is she safe?" "Outside," Leo sniffled, "behind the big trash can." Doc nodded to Victor, who gave a slight, affirmative jerk of his head. Doc rose and walked toward the back door of the diner. He pushed it open and found her exactly where Leo said she'd be. A young woman, Sarah, was huddled behind the dumpster, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had a split lip, and the beginnings of a dark bruise were forming on her jaw. When she saw Doc, another large man in a leather vest, she flinched and tried to make herself smaller. "Ma'am," Doc said, holding his hands up in a non-threatening gesture. "My name is Doc. Your son, Leo, is inside. He's safe. We're not going to let that man hurt either of you again." He slowly approached, his medic training taking over. "Can I take a look at your face? I just want to make sure you're okay." Her fear was warring with her desperation. She looked at his hands, then at his eyes, and saw not a threat, but a genuine, gentle concern. She gave a small, hesitant nod. Doc knelt beside her, his touch surprisingly gentle as he examined her injuries. "It's just a split lip and a bad bruise," he said reassuringly, "but we should get you checked out properly." He helped her to her feet and led her back inside just as the wail of sirens grew closer. The sight that greeted her was surreal. Her abuser, the man who had terrorized her for months, was still pinned to the wall by a biker who seemed as immovable as granite. Her son was standing next to another biker, the one with the pale, authoritative eyes, who had placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. The rest of the diner patrons were watching in stunned silence. Two police cruisers screeched to a halt outside. A local sheriff, a man named Henderson with a weary face and a slight paunch, stepped out, his hand resting on his service weapon. He saw the motorcycles parked in a neat row and his expression soured. He walked into the diner expecting a bar fight, a scene of chaos. Instead, he found a strange, controlled tableau. "What in the hell is going on here, Victor?" Henderson asked, his eyes immediately finding the club president. He knew the Iron Sentinels. He didn't like them, but he respected their rigid, if unorthodox, code. They policed their own and never caused trouble in his town. Victor turned to face him, his demeanor calm and respectful. "Sheriff, glad you could make it. This man," he said, nodding toward Richard, "is Richard Sterling. He was violating a restraining order. We witnessed him assault this woman," he gestured to Sarah, "and attempt to abduct her child. The boy came to us for help. We contained the situation until you could arrive." Henderson looked from Victor to the terrified woman and child, then to the sputtering, enraged man pinned to the wall. He walked over to Sarah. "Ma'am, is this true?" Surrounded by a protective semicircle of leather-clad men, Sarah found a strength she didn't know she possessed. The terror that had kept her silent for so long was finally being replaced by a spark of defiance. She looked the sheriff straight in the eye. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "It's true. He's not allowed near us. He broke into our apartment, he hit me, and he tried to take my son." That was all Henderson needed to hear. He and his deputy cuffed Richard, who was now screaming threats and insults. "You'll regret this. I have lawyers. I'll own this whole town. You'll all pay." His voice was shrill, the desperate blustering of a bully who had lost all control. As the deputies dragged him out the door, Richard locked eyes with Victor one last time. "This isn't over," he shrieked. "When I get out, you're all dead. Her, the kid, all of you." Victor didn't flinch. He just met the man's gaze with his icy blue stare and said two words, low and certain. "No, you won't." The words carried a finality that was more chilling than any shouted threat. Richard was gone, but the echo of his promise lingered in the air. Later that day at the Iron Sentinels clubhouse, the mood was somber. The clubhouse was a converted warehouse smelling of oil, leather, and stale beer. It was their sanctuary. Victor stood before a long wooden table where the other members sat. "Richard Sterling posted bail an hour ago," Ghost reported, reading from his tablet. "High-powered lawyer from the city. He's out." A wave of unease went through the room. Ricky, the young prospect, spoke up. "President, what are we going to do? That woman and her kid, he's going to go right back after them." "He won't get the chance," Victor said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every man there. "Ghost, I want you to find them a new place. Another town, quiet, somewhere off the beaten path. I want a full workup on Sterling, his habits, his finances, his weaknesses, everything." Ghost nodded once. "Already on it." "Bear," Victor continued, "once Ghost finds a place, you and the prospects will handle the move. Quietly, quickly, get them out of that apartment tonight. Doc, you're on medical. Make sure Sarah sees a real doctor and find a counselor for the boy. This club will cover all of it." "And what about Sterling?" Bear rumbled, his big hands clenched into fists on the table. Victor's expression was grim. "We let the law do its job for now, but we put the word out. Sterling is not to be touched, not to be harmed, but he is to be watched. He needs to know that wherever he goes, whatever he does, an eye is on him. He needs to know that if he even thinks about going near that family again, the world will close in on him. He won't go to jail. He'll just disappear." The club's resources, a network built over decades, were mobilized for a woman and child They had met only hours before. They found a small two-bedroom apartment for Sarah in a town 50 miles away. Bear and 3 prospects showed up at her old apartment that night in an unmarked panel van. They packed her meager belongings with surprising care and efficiency, moving like a well-oiled machine. By dawn, her old life was packed away, and she and Leo were on their way to a new one. The story of the diner incident spread like wildfire through the small town. The bikers, once regarded with fear and suspicion, were now the subject of whispered admiration. Flo, the waitress at the Morning Glory, started a collection jar on the counter with a sign that read, "For Leo and his mom." It was filled to the brim by the end of the week. Sheriff Henderson made a quiet phone call to the sheriff in the next county, giving him a heads up about Sarah's situation and a personal recommendation to keep an extra patrol car near her new address. The community, which had once turned a blind eye, was now rallying around the victims, inspired by the actions of the men they had so badly misjudged. The Iron Sentinels didn't just move Sarah, they rebuilt her life. The new apartment was fully furnished, paid for 3 months in advance. The club's treasurer, an accountant in his day job, helped her sort out her finances. They found her a job as a receptionist at a trucking company owned by a former member, a man who understood the importance of loyalty and second chances. They were giving her more than just safety. They were giving her a future. A few weeks later, once Sarah and Leo were settled, she drove back to the clubhouse. She walked in nervously, holding a freshly baked apple pie. The place went quiet as she entered, the tough-looking men stopping their conversations to look at her. She saw Victor sitting at the head of the long table and walked toward him. I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "For everything. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Victor gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down, Sarah. There's nothing to repay." She sat, placing the pie on the table. She looked at the men around her, Bear, Ghost, Doc, and the others. She had to ask. "Why?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't know me. You didn't know Leo. Why would you do all of this for strangers?" Victor was silent for a long moment. He looked at his brothers, a silent communication passing between them. Then he looked back at Sarah. "We're not so different, you and us," he began, his voice low and thoughtful. "People look at us and they see the leather, the bikes, the patches. They see trouble. They make up their minds before they know a thing about us. They judge. We know what it's like to be on the outside, to be misunderstood." He nodded toward Bear, whose massive shoulders seemed to slump for a moment. "Bear, here. He grew up in a house just like yours. He spent his childhood listening to his mother cry through a locked door. He watched the man who was supposed to protect her hurt her instead. The day he turned 16, he stood between them. He took the beating meant for her, and he swore on his life that he would never, ever let a man raise a hand to a woman or a child again if he was there to stop it." Bear didn't speak. He just stared at the scarred knuckles of his own hands, lost in a memory a lifetime away. Victor then looked at Ghost, who was staring intently at a spot on the far wall. Ghost had a little sister. She was smart, funny, the light of his family's life. When he was deployed overseas, she disappeared, just vanished. The police looked for a while, then the case went cold. He came home to a broken family. He spent the rest of his life looking, not just for her, but for anyone who's lost. He finds people. He puts families back together because his own was torn apart. It's the only thing that keeps the ghosts at bay. Finally, Victor looked at Sarah, his own eyes filled with a deep, ancient pain. "I grew up in the system, bounced from one foster home to another. Some were okay, some weren't. I learned young that there are 2 kinds of people in this world, those who prey on the weak and those who stand up for them. For a long time, there was no one standing up for me, so I learned to stand up for myself. And then I found others like me, men who had been broken, discarded, and forgotten, and we made a promise to each other. He swept his hand around the room, indicating all the members of the club. The Iron Sentinels were born from that promise. Our code is simple. We protect our own, and we protect those who have no one else. We do it because no one did it for us. Tears were streaming down Sarah's face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of understanding, of a profound and overwhelming gratitude. These men weren't just bikers, they were survivors. They were wounded healers turning their own scars into shields for others. Just then, Leo, who had been hiding shyly behind his mother's legs, stepped forward. He clutched a piece of paper in his small hand. He walked right up to Victor and held it out. Victor took it gently. It was a child's drawing done in crayon. It depicted 5 large stick-figure men with scribbled beards and black vests, all standing on motorcycles. They formed a circle around a small house, where a smiling woman and a little boy stood, waving. Above the scene, in wobbly backward letters, Leo had written, "My Guardian Angles." Victor stared at the drawing, and for the first time, Sarah saw the iron-willed president's composure break. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his pale blue eyes and making them shine. He looked at Leo. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the best damn thing I've ever seen." 1 year later, the sun was bright over a suburban baseball field. The crack of a bat echoed through the air, followed by a chorus of cheers. On the field, a little boy named Leo rounded second base, a look of pure joy on his face. He was healthy, happy, and confident. In the stands, his mother, Sarah, cheered louder than anyone. She was now the shift manager at the trucking company, respected and self-sufficient. Her face was free of bruises, her eyes bright with hope. Sitting next to her on the bleachers were 2 large men in faded jeans and T-shirts that did little to hide their muscular frames. One was Bear, the other was Doc. They watched the game with the focused intensity of proud uncles, shouting encouragement to Leo and arguing good-naturedly with the umpire. They were a regular fixture at his games. They were his family. Miles away in the Iron Sentinels clubhouse, Victor sat at his desk, going over the club's ledgers. On the wall behind him, right next to the club's charter, hung a simple wooden frame. Inside it was a child's crayon drawing of 5 guardian angels on motorcycles. It was a sacred relic, a constant reminder of their code, their promise. Since helping Sarah, the club had quietly funded a small underground network that helped other victims of domestic abuse escape and start new lives. They had found a new purpose, a new mission that went beyond the brotherhood of the road. The world is full of monsters, and they often wear the masks of respectable men. But it is also full of heroes, and they often don't look the way you'd expect. They don't always wear shining armor or ride white horses. Sometimes they wear worn leather and ride roaring machines of chrome and steel. They are the outcasts, the misunderstood, the men forged in fire who have decided to use their strength not to break the world, but to protect the most fragile parts of it. Real strength isn't about how loud you are or how tough you look. It's about what you do when you see someone who can't fight for themselves. It's about answering a call for help that you were never expecting to receive.